test with that side.
Right, can I check with my colleagues I've got permission to start? No, I'll wait for the microphone. Sorry. I was shouting for. Hello? No, it's not working. Good. Right. We can begin. Hello, thank you very much for coming tonight. If we haven't met so far, I'm James Kirkup. I'm the Director of the Social Market Foundation. You are here, I hope you know, for this event, which just to explain a fairly confusing set of acronyms. So we are the Social Market Foundation. We're a cross-party think tank based at Westminster, also self-evidently operating across the nations. We are here in partnership with our friends at WPI Economics, represented by Matt Oakley on my right, who are in turn working with our also other friends from CPT, represented by Paul White on my left. At the end of the night, there's a prize for anybody who can form the best Scrabble word out of the letters SMF, WPI, and CPT. I think you can get 6 letters out. Yeah, 6 letter word out of it. But if you can beat that, I'll the fruit bag crisps. Before I get to the topic, just a quick bit of housekeeping. That camera there, hello the camera, is currently broadcasting, narrowcasting, middlecasting this event to YouTube because we now put all of our events up on the Social Market Foundation YouTube channel. So a couple of things. That means that you can always watch this again. You can go away and tell your friends how marvellous it was and tell them that they can watch it again. But also just bear in mind that when we get to questions, after we've heard from our panellists, that when you talk, you're not just talking to people in the room, you're also talking to the internet for all eternity. So just bear that one in mind. I'm sure nobody's going to say anything career-endingly daft, but just bear that one in mind. Quick, before I'm not going to give report cards of our speakers. I'll let them introduce themselves. But just to point out, you may have spotted that we changed Claire's. We originally advertised this session with Claire Daly from Transit. Fortunately, she's come down with COVID, which appears to still be a thing. But we've been able to secure another Claire Miller. We're very grateful to her for stepping in. I should point out to you, eagle-eyed attendees will have noticed this week we've now got 2 Green politicians on the panel, and I did say we're a cross-party think tank. This is a happy coincidence. Other parties are available. We are very happy and keen to hear from people of all parties. So when we did this event in Cardiff a couple of weeks ago, we were at WPI Cymru, and when we did it in Westminster before Christmas, we had a Conservative Transport Minister. So we really are working with people of all parties on this one. I think that's the housekeeping over. The topic, again, the speakers are much more eloquent on the topic than I am. It is about the decarbonisation dividend that can be unlocked with greater shift to use of buses. But that will be explored by all the panelists. They'll give you short or medium-length opening remarks, and then we'll have a discussion and some questions. The first person I'm going to turn to is Paul White from CPT, who will give us the proverbial word from our sponsors. And CPT have kindly made this whole project, all these events across the country possible. So I'm not sure. Paul, we've only got one. Yeah, we're being very very efficient on the top. So we've only got one mic. I'm going to give this to Paul.
Thanks, James. Hello, everybody, and thank you for coming this evening. I'm Paul White, I'm the Director of CPT. I've been looking forward to this event in the Storytelling Centre because I think with this piece of work, we actually do have a good story to tell about decarbonisation and the bus industry in maybe a way. So before I talk about the report, I'll just touch on CPT and who we are. CPT is the trade association for the bus and coach sectors across the UK. In Scotland, bus accounts for about 3/4 of all public transport trips, and our members provide vital transport links up and down the country, connecting communities, enabling economic growth and delivering sustainable tourism. CPT has been heavily involved in the decarbonisation journey that we're all on. We represent our members through the Scottish Government's Bus Decarbonisation Task Force. We've been working with stakeholders, including the energy sector, vehicle manufacturers and finance houses, and contributing as members of the Climate Emergency Response Group. trying to balance the need and our desire to contribute to achieving Scotland's net zero targets with the practicalities of delivering affordable and accessible public transport. Here in Scotland, we've got a decarbonisation story to be proud of. Operators with government assistance have accelerated investment in zero-emission vehicles and infrastructure, and we're leading the UK in this regard. And I read recently that bus is the mode that's furthest through its net zero transition. But I think we all have to be cognizant of the fact that the zero-emission vehicle aspect of reaching decarbonisation, as important as it is, it can't be the sole focus of our work, and that's really what this report about lets us to expand upon. It must come hand in hand with encouraging people to consider more sustainable transport choices and nudging people away from their car dependency. And thankfully, that's not a message that's new to Scotland. We've seen it in the Scottish Government's work for a number of years, and the National Transport Strategy, which acknowledges and advocates modal shift to sustainable and active travel. And we've got the commitment to cut car kilometres by 20% by 2030, and I believe it's 30% in Edinburgh. We've got the free travel for under 22 scheme, which was launched last year and is growing month on month. But post-COVID, the decarbonisation journey is only going to be more difficult, and we've got to maximise all aspects of cutting carbon from transport. I think we've got to think differently, and we've got to think big. And I think this work we're here to discuss, it helps put that in Scottish context and start some of the conversations that we need to be having about the policy choices that could be made to make a real step change in our carbon emissions. As the report sets out, it's available online, you can have a read of it, there's a link up there I think we're going to show. As the report sets out, modal shift to bus is both necessary and desirable, and that has to be ambitious, it has to be prioritised locally and be delivered alongside measures that discourage car use. It's apt that we're here in Edinburgh for this discussion because this is a city that knows all too well about how the public can react to proposals for a congestion charge, for example. But we're experiencing a climate change emergency, and we have to realise that. We're in an entirely different political landscape, and we need to be bold, be brave, and attempt to generate the political will and the public buy-in for encouraging people to make that shift to public transport or to active travel. And I think in Scotland we've got a great opportunity to lead the way for the rest of the UK in this regard. I'd like to thank WPI for all the work that went into the report, and I look forward to discussing with the panel with all of you tonight. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Paul. And our next speaker, who actually has slides for you too, is a bit great. Who doesn't have slides? Okay, well, you can look at the top sheet of slides on screen. Our next speaker is Matt Oakley from WPI Economics. He's also a senior researcher at the SMF, which explains the connection here. But anyway, Matt is not going to talk you through the slides, so just listen to his golden words talking about his report there.
Even more confusingly than that, I've got some slides in here, which I'm going to talk to, but not share with you, just to keep you all guessing. So thanks for those comments. And I think quite a lot of what the report covers has been covered really well by Paul already. So what I'll try and do is set out what's actually been around a year's worth of work so far, in not too much detail, because obviously it's a year's worth of work, but give you a flavour of what we've been doing and some of the narratives and some of the arguments that have come out of that, and leave you probably, hopefully, to go away after this and kind of delve into the report itself. So the report was, the work was split into two phases. The first, really trying to outline what's needed in terms of modal shift to get to the net zero position that we want to get to by 2050. And as Paul said, what we concluded from that was that moving journeys from car to bus and coach is necessary, desirable, and importantly possible. Has to happen if we're going to hit those net zero ambitions. It's necessary because obviously we need it for net zero, but also we need it for a just transition, and that's really important. Some of the work we've done shows how important it is to that kind of just transition. It's desirable because it comes with a wide range of benefits alongside those environmental benefits, which can boost the economy, improve kind of social outcomes, and really help to regenerate local areas which have been left behind. And possible because we've seen existing evidence that shows that the public are willing to take steps and take that action if the right kind of bus services and right kind of travel options are available to them. So with that conclusion, the first report really outlines, I guess, kind of what the scale of that change would be needed. Overall, across GB, we argued that bus patronage would need to increase by around, well, a little bit more than 80% between now and 2050. That sounds quite a lot. That's nearly doubling bus patronage. Obviously, it is quite a lot. But in terms of in practical terms, what that represents is every person switching just over 2 car trips per month, or around 26 trips a year, to bus by 2050. So really showing that quite small changes by each of us can make a really big contribution to that delivery of net zero. Going back the other way, that sounds like it's not very much. That small changes are going to be quite easy. We can't forget, though, that comes on the back of a really significant decline in bus patronage over several decades now. So really what we've seen is an average decline of around 11% patronage per decade in the previous couple of decades. And what our suggestions would mean was an increase of 25% per decade over the period to 2025. So really, we need to turn around the decline we've seen in previous decades to a much more significant increase in future. So the question then is how do we achieve that? We know it's necessary if we want to deliver what we think we need to around net zero. So the second stage of the work is really about how we might achieve that. Our starting point was to look at existing policy. Across GB, there are fairly significant action to try and promote the use of bus and coach. Paul has outlined, I think, probably a much more ambitious range of policies and interventions than, particularly than England, up here in Scotland, in terms of trying to get that shift from car into more sustainable forms of transport, and that's really, really positive, of course. But our analysis for this report shows that even that really positive approach is not going to be enough. So what we've done is assumed out to 2050 a similar sort of profile of policy responses that we've seen recently, both in terms of funding and investment. And what we estimate is that would deliver around 64 million additional bus journeys that would otherwise have been travelled by car. So a big increase in bus journeys, but actually only representing around 20% of the modal shift that we needed to deliver that net zero ambition. So the question for this report then is, how do we deliver the rest of that 80%, the 80% we need to get to the level of modal shift that we need? Two obvious things we ruled out initially. Firstly, can we achieve this by just making motoring more expensive? Our estimates suggest that if we were just going to make motoring more expensive, we'd need to increase the general cost of motoring by around 133% in real terms by 2050 to make that happen. I see some smiles in the audience. That is not politically sustainable, and it is not going to happen. So we immediately ruled that one out as a sensible approach on its own. The second thought was, well, could we just deliver this by making all buses free? Well, that's a good option potentially. It's expensive. It costs around £13 billion up to 2050, and also only delivers a relatively modest level of modal shift, so around 11% of what's needed. So it's both expensive on its own and doesn't deliver what we need. So again, on its own, is not going to be effective. So essentially what we came up with is that no one policy is going to make this happen. We need a set of policies, a package of complementary measures to really make this happen. And what we focused on are kind of four themes here. Firstly, increasing the attractiveness of the bus network, so how you invest in bus essentially. Secondly, making buses cheaper, so some kind of subsidy, some kind of work to make buses cheaper. Thirdly, discouraging the use of cars in some way, shape or form. And then fourthly, underpinning all those things were behavioural interventions to try and, I guess, supercharge the effectiveness of those three other policies. Now we took those ideas out to a range of stakeholder events across GB, and really developed what I describe as a long list of potential policy options, which you'll find at the back of the report as the annex. We worked with stakeholders and with CPT to, I guess, shortlist some of those, and focused on around 6 or 7 potential options to show what might be possible. So we looked at an ambitious investment scenario where investment in the bus network is much, much stronger. We looked at a salary sacrifice scheme for people in work to say, actually, could we tax incentivise the use of buses like we use like we did with childcare vouchers, for instance? Could we have a fare cap for single journeys? And then could we discourage the use of car by introducing a congestion zone? We showed a couple of different options for how that might look. Ultimately, what that showed was that you could, from each of those, get a fairly significant increase in bus patronage. Again, on each of them on their own wouldn't deliver what we need, but actually, in combination, we think you could get a fairly long way towards delivering what we need just with those policies. So, just with 3 policies, so looking at ambitious investment in buses, a £2 fare cap, and then a comprehensive congestion charge. We think we could get around 3/4 of the way towards the modal shift required by 2050 to deliver on net zero ambitions. The remaining gap, obviously, that 25%. Actually, if we do that in a way, we deliver that alongside those 3 policies, those behavioural interventions, those nudges, those effective communication strategies. Actually, we think that could go a long way to actually fill in that gap and getting towards that 100%. So I think what we're trying to show here is that by being ambitious, by putting together a package of policies that we think are sensible, we could get most of the way, if not all the way, towards that modal shift required. And importantly, the report also shows, I think the last point that we made in the initial report, that this isn't just about the environment and net zero. This is also about a whole range of different benefits that come from modal shift. We showed socioeconomic benefits worth £3.4 billion from changing travel patterns, and also significant increases in employment, and particularly in some more deprived areas, which could lead from the investment in the bus network. So really quite big benefits in terms of those wider socioeconomic benefits that could come from this. So overall, what the report shows, hopefully, is that if we are fairly ambitious and put together a really comprehensive package that supports that modal shift, we can get there, and that will deliver both the net zero ambitions, but also really significant wider benefits to Scotland and indeed the rest of Great Britain. And what we try to finish with then is I guess a set of principles for making this happen. The obvious point being that modal shift can't be piecemeal, that it needs to be a part of an ambitious strategy if we're going to achieve the change that we want to see. Secondly, the modal shift policy needs to be fully integrated with broader measures to reduce the use of private cars. So it's part of a much broader strategy. We need some certainty, thirdly, on the financial footing on which this is happening. So much more certainty around the investment and funds available for buses. And then finally, it needs all of us to work together. Essentially, this is not something which one organisation, a sector, government, the industry can do on their own. It's going to take partnership working to ensure it delivers. And hopefully, the events we're doing can start that conversation. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Matt. And now I'll hand the mic over to our outstanding Cllr. It's very unfair, or superior Cllr. We upgraded to Cllr Miller from Edinburgh City Council.
Thanks. Yeah, happy to be the replacement Cllr, and thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure. I was going to be sitting over here in this audience, and so just moving here and facing the other way is a slight change of perspective. So I'm one of the city councillors in Edinburgh. I've sat on the Transport and Environment Committee for several years, and reading this report has been just such a breath of fresh air. It's so welcome to see this kind of work taking place, and the recommendations coming through from it are exactly what we need to be seeing. And so my perspective, unlike Claire Daly, is a much more hyper-local perspective, and something around the way that these kinds of policies would be implemented were we to be saying that this is actually the direction that we want to go in. So in the council, we are responsible as the roads authority for looking after the roads. We look after the public transport system in terms of, its infrastructure, and we liaise very closely with public transport. We're also in Edinburgh very privileged to be the owner of a bus company and a tram company. So we've got quite an unusual situation in Edinburgh, unlike other places in Scotland where we do have good public transport that is locally owned rather than privately owned as well. So it's quite a specific situation that we're in here. So when I make comments about what we can and can't do at a local authority level, that's my experience, and that's what I'm kind of drawing on. So I wasn't going to kind of cover the report in total, because obviously that's what Matthew has done very well, but I wanted to kind of pull out a couple of things which I feel that without these, we're not delivering at the moment, and these are the things which I think that we need to continue to focus on, which aren't maybe the big ticket sexy items that, like congestion charging or capping bus fares, which are very easy to describe and sell, but some of the kind of more nuanced things which I think that people who want to come to an event like this might be more interested in, as well as these. So first of all, I was thinking about what is one of the current barriers that we face to providing a much better bus service that will encourage people to shift out of their cars onto buses. And something that we face a lot in the council is that we're faced with the profit motive. Even though we have a publicly owned bus company in Edinburgh, we still have an issue where we have services that are constantly under threat because they aren't commercially viable, and we have to constantly be thinking about how do we ensure that there's a good quality network of public transport across the city. And we do have, even in a city like this where we're really well provided for, we have got pockets where people do not have access to good quality public transport, it's not well connected, and their best option is the car still. So what we really need to be looking at is that profit motive that sits behind all of this, and taking a really planned approach to public transport, thinking about how we integrate a very planned public transport network with an active travel network, thinking about the multimodal journeys that people inevitably will take, and providing people therefore with a product, thinking about it in marketing terms, of how will they get from the places that they are coming from to where they want to go to, and also taking into account that people do not take A to B journeys, that point-to-point journeys are no longer the way people travel, that they make multi-stage journeys, and we have to be thinking about that. So that has got relationships with interchange, with multimodality, and with demand-responsive transport, which are all covered in the report. But I think this planned approach and a profit motive being addressed really face on is really important. The second thing is behavioural change. So I think that another of the things that we really, really struggle with at the moment, and we would still struggle with even if we implement all of the things that are in this excellent report, is the perceptions that people have around bus travel who don't currently use buses, but who we want to start to use buses even just for some of their journeys. So it's a really strong piece of work here where we need to focus our efforts and our resource in a targeted way in specific communities to persuade them to make different choices, to try out different choices even, and to demonstrate the things that are attractive, that are changing, but the things that are attractive about bus travel already that they perhaps just don't even realise. And then when I'm talking about a targeted approach, I'm thinking about village communities or local communities, which we have plenty of in a city council like this, who can engage with campaigns and really also engage with community networks that exist there already, who can be thought leaders with their own communities. And the third thing I wanted to touch on was reliability. And when I wrote down that word, I thought everyone is going to think I mean about punctuality and frequency of service. And what I actually mean is reliability over the very, very long term. So I mean, when somebody decides to buy a house in Ratho, they know that there's going to be a bus service there for them and their family over the long term. when they decide to buy a new car, they know that they only need one and not two, because they know that there's a bus service that is going to be there for them in perpetuity. So it's about that commitment in the public sector and demonstrating that level of commitment to people so that they can make extremely long-term decisions, which is core to how we get them to change their behaviour. And that's not the day-to-day decision making, that's something much bigger and deeper. So that goes back to the behavioural change piece. So I think there's some really big chunky stuff there, which sits alongside the very clear policy interventions that you've described around fare capping and so on, which are definitely the bread and butter of the work that we do in the council. We have got lots of these kind of projects and programmes, and I think that they're the ones that are a little bit more subtle, that are essential to the success of these kinds of interventions, which I hope we will get at a national government level.
Thank you very much. Well, I mentioned the national level, you've queued up very nicely our final speaker, Mark Ruskell from Parliament.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks for inviting me here tonight, and lovely to be here on the panel and to share a panel with Cllr as well, because although we're party colleagues, we don't often get to sit on the same panels together. I very much welcome the report. I think there's some really interesting conclusions in there that Matthew's already outlined, and I'll reflect on those a little bit later. But what I wanted to say is that as transport spokesperson for the Greens in Parliament, I do listen to my constituents a lot. I listen to their everyday lived experiences and frustrations of using public transport, and in particular buses. And I represent a kind of accessible rural part of Scotland, mid-Scotland, Fife, so you'd be Stirling, Fife, Perth and Kinross. And I do listen to them, and I listen to colleagues in councils as well, and I speak to operators as well when they want to speak to me. But I do listen to my constituents. There's an example of that when we introduced the policy of first free bus travel for under 19s, which was upgraded to free bus travel for under 22s. We drew a lot of inspiration actually from youth groups in rural Scotland who were working with their young people to understand how disadvantage works or doesn't work for people who are living in rural communities, and how some of the lack of accessibility to transport intensifies that disadvantage, whether it's about access to employment opportunities or social interaction with their friends or study as well. So, I spend a lot of time, and my team do a lot of online events and a lot of engagement with constituents. And I think that dialogue in terms of behavioural change is absolutely critical. It's what the industry needs to get right going forward. Because a lot of people don't have a choice about whether to use a bus or not. But let's face it, a lot of us do. And when I sort of, open the door of my modest electric vehicle and I sit inside, because I live in a rural area in Lochranhead, and I sit down in that vehicle, I know that it's been designed to meet a lot of my needs. It's got the cup holders in the right place, it's got the seating configuration right, it's got the stereo in the right place. And it's been as a result of listening to customers and listening to feedback. So in a way, if we're to tempt people out of cars and onto public transport needs to make it as comfortable, easy, effective and reliable as the private car. If you're to tempt people like myself into using the bus, not that I actually have an alternative, because there's no way for me to get to Edinburgh to start my committee meetings, if I was to take the bus. But, what I would say is that there are some companies in Scotland who are absolutely getting that customer experience right. I'm hearing great feedback from constituents. But what I'm also hearing is some utterly dismal service as well. Cancellations at short notice, lack of communication, even young people who are using the national entitlement card, but facing lengthy delays, parents unsure, whether the children are going to be able to get home, when they've been in town or whatever, and just the quality of buses as well. Buses with holes in them, with water pouring in through the floor pans. So if we're to create a compelling alternative to the private car, we have to get the basic levels of service and reliability right from day one. And it does mean, I think, listening to the customers, listening to the public and understanding what their needs are, so we can then break that cycle of decline, which I think we're still in, unfortunately, with the bus sector in Scotland. I just want to say just a couple of thoughts then about the conclusions. I mean, I think the need for investment absolutely is there. And I think, electric vehicles, electric buses can be really transformational in terms of improving that customer experience. But, we need to see the bus priority lanes as well to improve journey times. We need to see better shelters. We need to see better communication systems as well to give people real-time information. I thought some of the conclusions in the report around making fares cheaper were really interesting. I really like the idea of a sort of a tax-free salary sacrifice scheme, and I'm wondering if that could be applied to rail as well. Maybe even an integrated rail ticket which you could buy as part of your salary every month. In terms of the £2 fare that I know is being trialled in England at the moment, I'm not sure about that at the moment. I think it'd be interesting to see what the impact of that trial is. But I think it's clear in Scotland that we've made a very serious commitment to the concessionary travel scheme. Concessionary travel now for over 60s, under 22s, people with disabilities. So that's a massive investment from the Scottish Government. It's a huge investment. And I do feel that actually building more fair fares on the back of that might be the way forward. So whether that's integration with ferries, whether that's about providing more attractive fare ticketing for families, for example. So, your parents go free or go half price if you take your kids on. I don't know. It's up to the industry to innovate in that space. But, I guess I'd urge you to sort of look at the investment that's taking place right now and see how you can build on that. Discouraging car use, absolutely. I mean, we're now, 20 years since the congestion charging referendum in Edinburgh. I mean, imagine what Edinburgh would look like if it had gone through, or if you'd had a council that had the guts just to do what Cllr did and just make it happen. Imagine what the investment would have been like now in Edinburgh's public transport. I know the original plan was focused on creating, I think, 3 tram lines, but imagine if that had been put into bus. What would it look like outside right now? So we do need some political bravery from this new generation of councillors like Cllr that are coming through to do the right work. But I think the other final conclusion I would reflect from the report is that everywhere is going to be different. And, I was speaking to Clackmannanshire council colleagues earlier on this week. They're in quite a different position as Scotland's smallest mainland local authority to, say, Glasgow. And the kind of solutions that they're going to come up with to break the cycle of decline and to invest in bus are going to have to be different. So I think the point that you made in the report about, tailoring the approach, tailoring the solutions to local needs is really important. But yeah, if we can get this right, we can tackle climate change, we can improve socioeconomic investment as well, and grow the economy or whatever. So yeah, it's going to be great, but we have to break the cycle of decline. And I think that's going to be challenging unless we really engage with the travelling public and actually provide services that they absolutely need.
Okay. Thank you, Mark. Now, well, in a second, I will go to all of you for any questions or observations before you've got your hand up already. Thank you. But before you do that, I'm going to abuse my prerogative as chair to just to test the ability of the panel on one particular aspect of what we just heard about there. Partly because I suspect we'll later on get into talking about discouraging people from the car. The discouragement point in Matt's 4-point plan. I was keen to, before we get to there, talk about the first point on Matt's plan, which was attractiveness. And just I'm going to turn to Paul and then Matt first to see any more thoughts from you on essentially that rising to that challenge on increasing the attractiveness of bus travel, and then we get to from our political friends on what policy can do to support that, and then we go to come out to one of you for your questions. So, Paul, tell us about making buses more attractive.
Thanks, James. So, what I would say about attractiveness of bus travel, I think coming out of the pandemic, we've got some challenges that are pandemic-based, some are Brexit-based, some are social economic. One of the ones that's really hampering our sector and other sectors is the driver shortage. So we're currently dealing with a situation where we have roughly around about 14% of the driver pool is vacant. And that has an impact on reliability of services and the ability to run services to the initial timetable. And therefore, if we can't, representative transport focus in the audience, and their research around what is key to passengers, what they look for most. Reliability of their service is right up there. So if you're thinking about using the bus, but you're not sure that that bus is going to actually be there, it's going to put you off. You're going to look at other modes. You may find another mode or invest in a car or whatever, and then you're lost with public transport. So we have those challenges that are not unique to us, but are ones that we're working on improving. I think we need to improve that, better that. The fact that we are facing increasing costs, a rising cost base, and a revenue that still hasn't recovered from the pandemic is another factor that makes investment decisions difficult. So these are things that we need to look at. How do we improve the attractiveness of the bus? I think that there are things that we can do that encourage. I think we need to tackle congestion. I think is probably my number one point. I think what people look for is, alongside reliability, journey time. And one of the things that we did a piece of work about 5 years ago, looking at the factors that impact patronage and bus use, and the conclusions of that were about 3/4 were out with the bus operators control. We can vary fares, we can look to invest in vehicles that have got Wi-Fi and various other things, and driver training. But if a bus is stuck in traffic, if people feel that their journey time is going to be twice that it might be from another mode, then they're not going to use it. So I think there's work we can do in partnership with local authorities to see what we can do to free bus from congestion where possible. And I think that is probably the first step to then. That in turn leads to reduced operating costs, which allows for investment, which increases the attractiveness. So it's a virtuous circle, really, if we can crack that one. So that's probably the point I would major on.
Thank you very much, Paul. I'm actually currently cut off my Dokin's chance to talk about this. It goes to Cllr instead. Since Paul's talked about local authority, what you can do to reduce congestion. Is that fair that this is where the policymaker responsibility lies in terms of boosting the attractiveness of buses? It's about essentially allowing buses to travel more freely along streets?
Yeah, I think 100%. It's something which we've been doing loads of work on, and one of my colleagues is sitting in the audience as well, nodding along. And I think we've struggled with this because if we reallocate space, which is what we want to do on our roads to create more dedicated bus lanes, what we do is we then push the problem onto side streets, which then queue up with private cars. So we've been working through a lot of detail with officers recently on how do we ensure that we do that proper reallocation of space to make sure that bus priority lanes are provided, but then not create knock-on impacts elsewhere in neighbourhood residential areas. But we are in the midst of a progress of a plan at the moment to get towards more of a circulation plan model where the city centre would have a segmented model, but the whole city would also have a clear approach around bus corridors, active travel corridors, and so on, and really taking a much more planned approach to how we allocate our street space, because we absolutely recognise that's the case, and that congestion is definitely one of the causes of preventing people. That piece around reliability is key to this. If you are taking a leisure journey, then you don't mind whether you're 5 minutes one side or the other. But if you're making an appointment, if it's for work, if it's for anything important at all, you do need to know exactly when you're going to leave and when you're going to arrive. So yes, I think we do bear a lot of responsibility, but we need to get the support from other levels of government to be able to make those decisions and choices. And we also need to be able to build the support within our residents to have the mandate in order to implement that.
Thank you. Excellently well behaved panelists. You're all setting each other's next remarks. I'm going to go to Mark Ruskell to ask about what the national level policy interventions are to make us more attractive. Is that congestion? If so, what can you do from the Parliament?
Well, I mean, it does need that leadership at local level. You do need to see local transport strategies and the kind of local planning that Cllr is describing to take that joined up approach and to solve some of those quite thorny transport issues that cities have. And again, will be different to small towns and villages. So there's an element of leadership there, but then of course, the important thing then is for government to invest and to create the the streams of support, be it capital or revenue, to allow that work to proceed at local levels. So, it does need to be joined up. And I think there are different entry points for that conversation at the moment about how our places can look different going forward, because it is about bus, but it's also about being able to walk or wheel to the bus safely as well, and it's about taking away all of those little barriers to the use of public transport. So that might be a simple thing. It might be about congested roads, and journey times, but it might also be the fact that outside of your house, there isn't a drop curb, and if you're in a wheelchair, then that's another barrier for you crossing the road and then getting to the bus stop. So taking away all these barriers is important, and I think with the introduction of the pavement parking ban later on this year, again gives another opportunity to have that conversation with communities about how we make them more accessible, with public transport and bus use being an important part of that, but only being one part of the kind of consideration that needs to be taken. I did just want to come back on reliability, because I think reliability is just what my constituents continually talk about, and it's that lived experience of getting on a bus and then it not turning up or it being cancelled at the other end. It can really destroy people's confidence in using public transport. And I'm seeing this with young people, because what we've seen with under-22s bus has been remarkable. Like 45 million journeys, hundreds of thousands of young people now using bus, and I think many of them have perhaps never even been on a bus before the introduction of the National Entitlement Card. But that's an entire new generation of people who are experiencing public transport, sometimes for the first time in their lives. And it's really interesting when I talk to young people, because they're like, I've got this entitlement card, it's great, I can go and see my friends, and we've all got it now, and it's great, it's liberating, not just saving money, but it's also giving them a new sense of confidence as well. But I also get the stories back, like, what's going on, Dad? It took 25 minutes for the bus to arrive. And my concern is that unless we get the quality of service right, with concessionary travel, what we're doing is we're educating and teaching a young generation of people to use public transport. But my concern is that, unless the service is right, we actually put them off. So, reliability is really, really key. There's an amazing opportunity with free bus travel under 22s to get a generation of people who take the bus first and foremost. But if we don't get the reliability right, I'm worried that actually they'll see it as a lesser form of transport. And I think that's a risk.
Thank you very much. I suppose the lady on the front there had a question. Tell us who you are before the question, and then after that, I'll the question, then one there and there. Before we'll be doing this briskly, so your question.
Hi, I'm Kristen Lane from WSP, and I wanted to drill down a little bit into what it means to specifically to have an ambitious investment in the bus network. So I guess the first part of that question is for Matt. And in terms of your model, when you say that you have these nice 3 things that add up to the appropriate level of modal shift, what specifically was that ambitious investment, and not just pound amount, what actually was being done with that, other than just kind of some cash? And then the second question is to all the panelists, and that is to you all, where does
Space and ways are coming.
where do park and rides fit into your perspective? Because that's an interesting kind of intervention.
So we'll go quickly to Matt for a point on investment, and then everyone else will come. We'll talk. Anyone who wants to go in and talk on park and ride can do that. We'll go to the gentleman in the back corner.
So I think probably the best way to answer that is to say exactly the same as Mark has been saying, that we need to listen to people who might use the buses in order to design how that investment is used, and that's both in terms of the services and the quality of the bus travel itself. Our report was not detailed enough to say exactly that we are going to put on these routes and we're going to give everybody this frequency and this speed and this sort of experience. What we did was say that the total The total annual cost was around 128 million annual cost in Scotland, and that would have a similar effect to evidence of previous rounds of investment in terms of increasing bus patronage. Obviously, how that is spent, invested, is key. And that goes straight back to the point already made that we need to have a really, really careful view and a good discussion with people about how to use that, where to put the services, where to put the investment, and make sure that has the biggest bang for buck we can.
Thank you. Okay, Paul first, then Claire on park and ride.
Thanks, James. Can I first of all just go back to your first question about the investment? I think there exists already some bus service improvement partnerships across Scotland. So I think the idea is that you would sort of take some of that money and put it through the partnership model, generate more partnerships, and really trying to form the local solutions. Where do you require the investment locally? Is it because I think across Scotland you have different solutions for every bit. So I think in my mind that's probably the main way we deliver that money to deliver investment in the bus network. And it's worth pointing out, I think, that is not the industry having its hand out saying these are the 5 things that we want you to do with this money. Could you do them, please? It's a conversation about if you do this, we can do this, and we guarantee a route for so long, or we'll increase the frequencies. This route will be 0 emission. So it has to be a kind of a partnership where you're both investing, and be that through just a cash investment or through other matching kind methods. On your point of parking rides, very important, as long as they're cited correct. I think what you want to avoid is parking rides just in where you have some spare land and you think, well, I can fit a parking ride here. There has to be the demand for the parking rides. You have to have like a transport corridor where you think that you're going to generate use and growth. And there's some good success stories there. And I'm thinking going across the Forth. And so I don't. That's all I have to say. It's an important part.
Thank you, Claire. Parking lot.
Yeah, just to expand on that on park and ride, I think it's incredibly important, not just where it is, and you're right, Paul, it's not just a spare bit of land that we use for park and ride. We need to think about where we're putting it and for whom and what journeys is that then enabling and why is that the right journeys. I think in addition to that, we need to be thinking about making those excellent facilities in the same way that the bus should be an excellent experience on the inside of a bus. You need to have excellent experience when you're waiting for the bus, and that interchange point is a key part of that. Are you dry? Are you warm? Is it comfortable? Can you work while you're there? Can you read a book while you're there? Can you make sure that you're safe? Women travelling alone need to know that they're safe in those spaces, and we're getting pushback, for example, in Edinburgh from nurses who will not use the park and ride along from the Royal Infirmary and prefer to drive to work because that location is not safe enough for them to trust it. So there's a lot of important considerations to make sure that it's a successful park and ride as well, and to again really target those individuals who we are looking to shift the mode of transport. And just quickly also to give a quick mention to saying park and ride, not just park and ride, but also a transport hub and a logistics hub, and really integrating some of those services that we think all relate to travel and transport, not just thinking of it as that single function of a park and ride.
Thank you. Mark.
Yeah, I mean, I think park and rides have got a strong role to play, but the issue for towns in accessible rural Scotland is that they often have very low car parking charges at the final destination, and they certainly. I think a lot of those councils will not be introducing workplace parking levies. So, for the traveller, what's the point in parking at a parking ride when you can just drive into town, park your car there, and it's only £2 a day, or it's free? So there has to be the right incentives for people to use it. I think they can be great hubs. Some really interesting parking rides that are being developed in Stirling. We've got one which has got a vast array of solar panels, and it's a great charging facility, and it's got capacity for about 50 electric vehicles. So for a council and a town that has a big rural hinterland, where it may be difficult for people to access, the town all the time using public transport, having that parking facility there and the ability then for people to then move on get the bus or get a train to the final destination. Makes a lot of sense, but the incentive has to be there, I think, and I don't think it's often there.
Thank you very much. Now I'm going to get the gentleman in the back corner got a question, and then we're going to that lady there who caught my eye. We'll do the questions together, and then if we've got time for this gentleman here, because I'm aware that your colleague from WSP has already had a question, so I'm not discriminating against you, but I'm just trying to make sure we spread the questions widely. So that gentleman there, then the lady in the second row.
Colin Howden from Transform Scotland. A question for Matthew. So a couple of years ago, Professor Ian Doherty at Stirling University did a piece of work for ScotRail, in which he did a report, and he concluded that in order to meet the government's 20% traffic reduction target by 2030, the rail patronage would be able to double between 2021 and 2030. So notwithstanding the very many challenges faced by getting the public transport mode share, or public transport volume increase we're talking here, is perhaps your report somewhat unambitious by suggesting an 80% increase in bus volume required by 2050?
More ambition possibly, and then that lady there.
Thank you very much. I'm Margaret Douglas from Public Health Scotland. There's two parts to my question. So I've done quite a lot of work over the years on the health impacts of different forms of transport. And there is no doubt at all that if we can shift a substantial number of people from car travel to bus travel, that would have very significant benefits from health, both in terms of reducing all of the many adverse effects of a car-dominated environment on individual travellers and the wider community, but also because if we can sustain bus services, that very greatly helps 28% of households in Scotland who don't have access to a private car. And being able to access things again is really important for health. So the first part is it helpful to make the health case as part of all of this? Because there are really significant health impacts. And the second part is linked to that is what is a tipping point, or is there a tipping point? So we've spoken about the cycle of decline, where we're seeing reduced bus patronage. That means operators very often respond by reducing frequency of services, and people use them less because they're less frequent, less reliable. What does it take to get the virtuous cycle where that works the opposite way, where more people are using services, they become more sustainable, become more frequent, therefore they're much more attractive. So what is the tipping point, and how do we get to it? Thank you.
Thank you. Now, what I'm going to ask the panel to do, actually, we give everyone one bite at both cherries, as it were. So, I'll go from right to left. So Matt can choose which of those bits he wants going on the ambition level, and also the health dimension. Same off for everybody else going across the table. So Matt.
More is more, I think is the answer. So the evidence we put together, the modelling we did, suggested that was about the right number. Obviously, if we can go beyond that, even better. Great. That's all I can say on that, really, I guess. On the health benefits, completely. On the health benefits, completely. It's not something we considered in the first report and the second report. So 100%, yeah, really, really strong health benefits. We should be part of the picture.
Okay, more ambition. I wondered when Matt was giving his presentation at the start. He said the ambition around reducing the attractiveness of the car, which some of the political. So I was wondering if you wanted to challenge him there and say you need more ambition there. So just general thoughts on the level of ambition required here, and also just on the health dimension.
Yeah, the health one actually is really interesting to me, and I'm really glad that you're here from public health, because I think for me that's one of the things that I made a core part of my work over the last few years. I decided in joining the Transport Committee to take a thematic approach to my work rather than a modal approach. And I think, so I was looking at safety and health and the impact on families and communities and inequalities. And by taking that more thematic approach to it, it broadened the way that I looked at transport as not just being a way to get from A to B, or, how do you get there and how quickly do you get there, but why, and what is good or bad about a different mode, and why should we take different choices. And that then speaks to the behavioural piece that I was talking about originally, about actually persuading people to make changes. And for me, I was talking about active travel and the reasons that is beneficial from a health point of view. And from an air quality point of view, but it's the same, you're right, for public transport, that there are health benefits. And I think by taking those more thematic approaches to transport rather than seeing it as a subject that's about logistics and engineering, we're more likely to create change in society, I believe. And I think it's about explaining those benefits to people and winning them over, and storytelling. Storytelling Centre is an excellent place to talk about these kinds of things. So 100% with you on that. I think you absolutely spot on with that comment. In terms of ambition, I think we struggle, I will be dead honest, so we struggle in the council to get the ambition that we want. So my party, obviously, would be very keen to charge car drivers, to make sure that we really shifted the balance in terms of the incentives and the disincentives around the choices that people make. We make no secret of that in our manifesto, top to bottom. But when we've got a council that is made up of 5 different political parties, and they are all trying to negotiate on how to make one decision, and it comes down to voting for or against something, it can be very, very difficult to have a nuanced conversation that then results in the kind of ambition that I would like to see. And we end up compromising, and that is the nature of the way that decisions are made in councils. And it frustrates me as much as it frustrates the public. And I think that we have to have a much more honest conversation when we're talking about policy, about eventually how is that implemented, and what does the political dimension do to that implementation, and how much compromise does there have to be in order to achieve anything at all, in order to step forward. And we quite often in the Green Group in the council make difficult compromises to support things that actually we don't think are ambitious enough, because we feel that that change is better than no change at all. But I do think that conversation is incredibly important. But we need to be much more honest about the fact that councils are run by political parties. In a lot of the councils in Scotland, in many it's independents and they work in a different way. But in our council, it is politically dominated, and we do have to recognise that that is the decision-making mechanism, and it's a barrier and a benefit. It's not perfect, and it does mean that ambition is missed and lacking in some places.
Thank you. Mark Ruskell, ambition and health, possibly together.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've got to make this real for people actually at the community level. So I think in addressing those 2 issues, I think we can go a lot further actually than 20% modal shift, 20% reduction in vehicle mileage, and I think we can also tackle health inequalities as well. But we need some exemplar projects where that thematic approach is being adopted. And I think perhaps the best one we have in Scotland at the moment is the Levenmouth rail route reopening, where a rail route is being reopened. That will benefit a set of communities that have had a long history of deprivation and health inequalities. But that's not the only bit that needs to be done. There's economic regeneration that needs to happen within communities. There is also improvement of infrastructure, active travel, work that needs to take place and is being invested in. There's behavioural change work. And what we're seeing now as a result of the investment in that rail route is that other partners, funders are coming in and putting money into doing some of that hard, detailed work with communities to improve the health inequalities and to open up options for transport and economic renewal. But it does take that joined up approach, and I think within that there's opportunities to improve bus services as well. I mean, party to some of those discussions around integrating the more rural communities that are at East Neuk into the new railway line, integrating timetabling, creating opportunities for people to benefit from a radically different way of travelling and connecting with opportunities. So, I'm hoping Levenmouth can shine a light on how you do this, how you do that important joined up thematic work on the ground, what it looks like for deprived communities, and what the benefits can be. And if we can, double down on that and get 30% reduction in 30% modal shift in Levenmouth, and hopefully we can achieve at least 20% elsewhere in Scotland.
Thanks. On the are we being ambitious enough with an 80% on bus? Just from the figures percentage, I mean, rail is about 20% of public transport trips, bus about 75%. So numbers wise is a bigger number, 80%. But I think what's the key point that I would make is that what's important is it's not just shuffling deck chairs. It's not the rail industry trying and fill the free travel for under 22s because it's taking real passengers onto the bus, and then bus trying to fill with the peak fares going through rail, because the bus passengers go to rail, and are we actually getting any car drivers onto either of these modes? So to me, that's the real key point. And on the health questions, and Margaret, we have to sit in her group that looks at transport and health matters, and it's been a real eye-opener, and I think CPT and the sector is learning a lot just now from engaging with health professionals, learning benefits and health impact assessments in our work, like we're doing with poverty campaigners, and the importance of transport with poverty, especially the cost of living crisis, and social inclusion and accessibility. We need to make strong cases that we are an enabler of improving these things, and facilitators are not a burden to these people that might be having health issues or poverty issues. That we can be there and provide reliable and affordable and accessible services. When it comes to your second point, how do you get to that tipping point? I think for me, just trying to in the last couple of minutes, I think that always stands out to me is investment per passenger. I think if we really valued bus and gave it the same kind of investment per passenger journey as rail or ferry gets, bus gets a fraction of either of those modes, then it would help make that case. It would help show that we value it. We understand the importance, and maybe how we make that case is by engaging bus passengers more, because if CPT says it, you should be investing more in bus. You'd say, well, you would say that, CPT. But we've got so many millions of people use the bus every year, but relatively quiet compared to the rail lobby or the cycle lobby. And how do we get people to say, we'd love you to invest more in our bus service and improve my journey things? And your example with your son saying the bus was 20 minutes late, this bus is rubbish. But maybe, and I don't know the circumstances, but maybe it was temporary traffic lights a mile back that held up the bus.
No.
But had it been, we do get examples of this where you get a letter to the bus company saying your bus is rubbish, it was late, and then there was extenuating circumstances, but you're not writing to the council saying you made my bus late. Also, I think we need to really have a conversation about how we provide transport after the pandemic, as we get to maybe we look to those patronage numbers and working on that, but if they don't come back, what do we do? How do we provide services? How do we get out of the pattern of low-cost tenders, where that's how transport is valued, maybe at the local authority level, where for school transport subsidised services, the low-cost tender wins, and then people's first experience of bus is a very low-leaky bus, because the person who owned that was able to provide the lowest cost tender. So if you value transport, you want that to be good. There's a cost. Every journey has a cost. So those are my thoughts there, James.
Thank you very much for that. I will with that, if Martin from the will forgive me, I'll actually wrap up at that point, because we started from like finishing 6 minutes late, so I failed in my sharing news. So I apologise for taking the next minute of your time. But with that, I'm going to draw things to a close despite it. Thanking all of you for coming, to remind you about the YouTube, because we do get lots of our viewers again watching again, because do share that video with people. But also just to ask you before you leave to give a hand of thanks to CPT, WPI, and our service.